I walk along Main Street, the snow crunching under my feet. Winter in this Midwestern town is like a knife in the back, cold, angry, and doesn't let go. My coat is full of holes, the wind passes right through it, but I'm used to it. The lights blink as if they are too lazy to shine, and the clouds overhead are heavy, gray, like my whole life. I spot the patrol car before I hear it. Flashes of red and blue cut through the dusk, and I know it's Harris. He always shows up when I least want him to. I won't stop. It's stupid to run, I'll slip on the ice and fall like last time. It's better this way. Jess, his voice is calm, but with a hint of fatigue, like that of a person who has been trying to save me for too long. I turn around. He leaned out of the window, his hat pushed back, his eyes looking as if they were looking for someone else in me. "Hi, Harris," I say. The voice is hoarse, as if not mine. Too many nights on the street, too many cigarettes that I don't even want to smoke. "You'll freeze," he nods at my coat. -10, Jess. Sit down. I shrug. I can't feel my fingers, I can't feel my legs either, but I'm not going to admit it. I'm fine. He sighs, as always. Sit down. This is not a request. I think about arguing, but the wind hits my face and I give up. I go to the car, open the door, and sit down. Inside it smells of coffee and leather, the heat from the stove burns, like a reminder of what I've lost. Harris is silent and pulls out onto the road. He never speaks right away. We drove past an old diner. Her neon sign flickers, barely alive. I remember sitting there with Troy in that booth by the window. Grace was a baby, sitting on my lap, and she was not yet born. We laughed, drank coffee, and I thought that this was love, that this would be forever. Now the diner is just a shadow like me. "You're not like that, Jess," Harris says, looking at the road. His voice is soft, but the words hit. "You're better than this." I smile as if I'm hearing this for the first time, although he says this every time. "You're repeating yourself, Harris. Maybe you're crazy." He doesn't laugh. Never laughs. I'm serious. "You don't belong on the street." I turn to the window. The snow is falling thicker and sticking to the glass. I don't belong anywhere. It's too bright in the area. The lamps are blinding. The floor smells of bleach. Harris takes me to the cell, but doesn't lock the door. It's just a formality. I sit down on the bench, and he gives me a paper cup. The coffee is lousy, but it's warm, and I hold on to it like it's something valuable. "Who should I call?" he asks, leaning against the bars. His badge shines like a mirror. I hate mirrors. "No one," I shake my head. He frowns, but doesn't argue. "Did you eat today?" I nod and lie. He knows, but is silent. "I'll be back soon," he says and leaves. His steps echo in the corridor. I drink coffee, it burns my tongue. The cell is quiet, only the heater hums. I close my eyes and the past creeps into my head. I open my eyes. The camera is still the same. The coffee has cooled down. I put the glass down and rub my hands. In the metal wall opposite is my reflection, cloudy, alien. I turn away. Harris returns with a blanket and a plastic sandwich. "Eat," he says, shoving it at me. "And don't lie that you're not hungry." I take a sandwich. Turkey with cheese, cheap food. I take a bite to get him to back off. "Thank you," I mutter. He sits down opposite. "Are you thinking of returning?" To them. I freeze. Grace, Noah. Their faces are in my head, her evil eyes, his quiet smile. I haven't seen them since the day I left, leaving a note. "Sorry, I can't." "They are better off without me," I whisper. "That's not true," he shakes his head. I'm silent. He won't understand. Nobody will understand. Not Lena, with her new love and happy life. Not Troy, who is probably already with someone else. Not me. Harris looks at me. "You can't run forever, Jess." "Neither from them, nor from myself." I swallow. The sandwich lies in the stomach like a stone. I'm not running. I'm surviving. He leans back. "Is this what you call survival?" I'm silent. Snow is falling outside the window, covering everything. I see Grace, her braids, her anger. I see Noah, his eyes, too old for 15. I see Troy, his hands on the other, his lies like snow. I met Oliver a long time ago, under a bridge by the river. He was sitting on a box, wearing a torn coat, reading a book without a cover. I thought he was just a tramp, but he spoke like a professor. "The river is honest," he said. "She sees right through you." I sat down next to him and leaned against the wall. "What does this mean?" He closed the book. "You can lie to yourself, but the water knows the truth." I laughed bitterly. "You're like a preacher." He smiled. He was a teacher. Philosophy. Until the world threw me away. I didn't ask what happened. There was no need. The river was noisy, carrying stones and secrets. I looked at my reflection in the water, broken, alien, and did not turn away. Harris stands up. "I'm letting you go, but I'll take you to the shelter." No arguing. I nod. He gives me a blanket, and I throw it over my shoulders. We walk to the car. The snow crunches. The tracks will disappear by morning. The city is silent. The streets are empty. I see a lake frozen like a mirror. I see a diner, a house, a bridge. I see Troy's smile, Grace's anger, Noah's silence. I see myself, broken, looking for a way back. Harris pulls up to the shelter. Its lights warm. "You're not alone, Jess," he says. "Just let someone in." I nod, but don't believe it. I go out. The snow is falling, covering everything. But somewhere the river whispers a truth that I don't want to hear. 17 years ago. Summer smelled of cut grass and freedom. I was 17, and the world seemed as big as the sky above the Ohio fields where I grew up. Our town was one of those where everyone knows each other, where every house keeps its little secrets, and the main street falls asleep by 9 in the evening. I was a proper girl. I studied with straight A's, helped my mother with the dishes, and went to church on Sundays. But that evening when I met Troy, something in me cracked, like glass under a stone. I was standing at the counter at Millie's, where I worked after school. It was late, almost closing time, and the hall was empty. Only the radio was quietly humming something about love and broken hearts. I was wiping down the counter, thinking about my algebra test, when the door dinged and he walked in. Troy wasn't one to be ignored. Tall, with broad shoulders, wearing a denim jacket just tattered enough to look cool. His hair, dark and slightly long, fell over his eyes, and he threw it back with a careless movement that made my heart, stupid and inexperienced, skip a beat. He smiled, and I realized that I was lost. "Hey," he said, sitting down on a high stool at the counter. "Is there coffee?" I nodded, feeling my cheeks heat up. "Yes, now." I turned to the coffee maker, trying not to look at him, but his gaze seemed to be stuck to me, warm and heavy, like the July air. "Are you new?" he asked while I poured coffee. His voice was low, with a slight hoarseness, as if he had just sung with a guitar. "No," I answered, placing the cup in front of him. "I work here all summer." He narrowed his eyes, studying me, and I suddenly felt naked, despite the stupid green apron. "Strange. I will remember you." I rolled my eyes, but everything was singing inside. "Maybe you're just not paying attention." He laughed, short and sincere, and for the first time I noticed how his eyes, blue as a lake on a clear day, lit up when he smiled. "Oh, I'm attentive. Believe me." I turned away, hiding my smile, and began to wipe the counter, although it was already shiny. He drank coffee without taking his eyes off me, and I felt the air between us thicken, like before a thunderstorm. "I'm Troy," he said when he finished. "And you?" "Jessica," I answered, and the name suddenly seemed too simple, too ordinary for this moment. "Jess," he said, shortening my name as if it already belonged to him. "It suits you." I didn't know what to answer, so I just shrugged, but my heart was beating like a drum. He left the dollar under the cup and left, promising to return. I watched him leave, his silhouette dissolving in the evening light, and I knew that he was not lying. A week later, he came again, and in another week. Each time he ordered coffee, although I saw that he drank it without pleasure, just to sit at the counter and chat with me. He talked about his old car, which he repaired himself, about how he dreams of leaving this town, about the songs he listens to on cassettes. I listened, laughed, teased him, and each time I felt him become a part of my world, like water that slowly seeps into the cracks. One evening he came in when I was finishing my shift. The rain was drumming on the roof, and Millie, the owner, had already gone home, leaving me to close it. Troy stood at the door, his wet jacket stuck to his shoulders, his hair glistening with drops. "Let's go for a walk," he said, as if the rain was not a reason to stay at home. "Are you crazy?" I took off my apron, looking at him. "It's pouring like buckets." He smiled that smile that made my knees weak. "And what? Are you afraid of getting wet?" I shook my head, but already knew that I would agree. I turned off the light, locked the door, and we walked out into the rain. The water was warm, summery, and I laughed as it ran down my face, washing away the fatigue of the day. Troy took my hand. His fingers were strong, slightly rough, and I felt a current run through my skin. We walked along an empty street, the lanterns reflected in the puddles like broken stars. He was saying something about his sister who had gone to California, but I barely listened, too busy feeling his hand in mine. We reached a park where an old oak tree spread its branches like a tent, and we stopped under it, sheltering from the rain. "Are you always this quiet?" he asked, looking at me. A drop rolled down his cheek, and I suddenly wanted to wipe it away. "I don't know," I answered, feeling my voice tremble. "Are you always so brave?" He laughed, stepping closer. "Only when I see someone for whom it's worth it." I froze, not knowing what to say. He was so close that I could smell his cologne mixed with the rain. His hand rose and touched my cheek, and I closed my eyes, surrendering to this moment. His fingers were warm despite the coldness of the water, and I felt the world shrink to that touch. "Jess," he said quietly, almost in a whisper, "I will never let you go." I opened my eyes, and his face was so close that I saw every eyelash, every drop on his skin. He leaned down, and his lips touched mine softly, hesitantly, as if he was afraid that I would disappear. I answered without thinking, and the rain disappeared, and the city disappeared, and all that was left was him. We stood under the oak tree, kissing while the rain drummed on the leaves, and I thought that this is love wet, warm, real. I was naive, stupid, but at that moment it didn't matter. I was with him, and that was enough. We started dating as if it was inevitable. Every evening after my shift, he would wait outside the diner, leaning against his car, and we would drive off somewhere to a lake where the water reflected the stars, or to an abandoned field where we could lie in the grass and look at the sky. He was charismatic, easily filling the silence, but there was also a shadow of selfishness in him, which I did not notice then. He wanted the world to revolve around him, and 17-year-old me was happy to be part of that world. One day, he took me to the river. It was already dark, and the moon hung over the water like a mirror. We sat on the shore, his arm around me, and I felt safer than ever. He took a small ring from his pocket, not a real one, just a cheap one, the kind they sell at gas stations, and put it on my finger. "This is not a proposal," he said, smiling. But it's a promise. You are mine, Jess." I looked at the ring shining in the moonlight, and my heart sank. "And you are mine," I answered, and he laughed, pulling me towards him. We kissed, lying on the grass, and the river whispered something of its own, eternal, indifferent. I didn't know then that rivers don't keep promises, that they flow without looking back, carrying away everything you trust them. That fall I brought him home for the first time. Mom, Lena, looked at him with suspicion, but he turned on his charm, and she melted like everyone else. We sat at dinner, and he told stories that made her laugh and made me feel special. But then, when he left, she said, "Be careful, Jessica. He's one of those people who loves to be loved." I ignored her words. I was in love, and it was like a disease sweet, blind, all-consuming. I saw in your future, the family, the life I dreamed of. I didn't see 3 thoughts of that summer come back to me like the smell of rain, like shadows on the water. I was young, stupid, in love. I thought Troy was forever. I didn't know that forever is just a word that breaks like glass when it hits the ground. 10 years have passed. The spring was soft, like the blanket that her mother, Lena, made for Grace when she was born. Our house in the suburbs of a town in Ohio was small but cozy, with peeling paint on the porch and a garden where I tried to grow tomatoes, but only ended up with weeds. I was 27, working as a nurse at the local hospital, and Troy was working on cars in a shop on the edge of town. We had two children, Grace, 7, with my brown hair and his stubborn gaze, and Noah, 5, quiet as a shadow, but with a smile that could melt the ice. Life was simple, stable, like the rhythm of the heartbeat on the monitor in the ward. But even then, on those warm days, I began to feel something in the air changing, like the smell of rain before a thunderstorm. Saturday morning started with the smell of pancakes and coffee. I stood at the stove, turning over golden rounds, while Grace chatted incessantly at the kitchen table. Her hair was in a messy braid, my job because she hated it when I tried too hard. Noah sat nearby, doodling on paper, his pencil moving slowly, intently. "Mom, can I go to Emma today?" Grace jabbed her fork into the pancake I had just placed on her plate. "She has a new puppy, and she said that he already knows how to fetch a ball." I smiled as I poured coffee into my mug. "Only if you do your homework. And no later, okay?" She rolled her eyes, but the corners of her lips twitched into a smile. "That's great." Noah raised his head, his eyes, the same blue as Troy's, sparkling. "Can I go?" "You're afraid of dogs," Grace teased, and he frowned, poking her with a pencil. "I'm not afraid," he said, but his voice was uncertain, and I laughed, putting the plate of pancakes on the table. "You can both go if Dad agrees to take you," I said, looking back at the door. Troy hadn't come down yet, although I could hear him fidgeting upstairs, muttering something to himself. Grace made a face. "Dad always gets up late on Saturdays." "Because he works hard," I said, and it was true. Troy took shifts until late in the evening, sometimes returning when the children were already asleep. I'm used to it, but lately his delays have become longer and his explanations shorter. I shouted towards the stairs, "Troy, the pancakes will get cold." I'm coming," came his voice, and a minute later he appeared in an old t-shirt and jeans, his hair disheveled. He looked tired, but his smile, the same one that made me fall in love 10 years ago, was still working. He patted Noah on the head and kissed the top of Grace's head before sitting down at the table. "What do we have here?" he asked, looking at the mountain of pancakes. "Jess, have you decided to feed the whole neighborhood again?" "Eat and don't grumble," I answered, pushing the syrup towards him. He caught my hand, squeezed it for a second, and I felt warm, like those days when it was just the two of us in the rain under the stars. "You're the best," he said, and I rolled my eyes, but everything started singing inside. The kids chatted, Troy joked, and the kitchen filled with laughter like sunshine. These were the moments for which I lived when everything seemed right, when we were a family, real, not ideal, but ours. I looked at Grace, who was trying to persuade Noah to eat a pancake with jam, and at Troy, who winked at me and thought that this was happiness. But even on those bright days, there were shadows. I noticed them, even though I didn't want to. Troy started checking his phone more often, turning the screen away when I approached. He said that these were clients, that the workshop was busy, but his eyes when he said this were different, not as open as before. He returned home later, smelling not only of oil and gasoline, but of something else, subtle, like someone else's cologne. I drove away these thoughts, convincing myself that it was fatigue that I was making up, but doubts, like water, seeped into the cracks. One evening, after I had put the kids to bed, I was sitting in the kitchen, leafing through a magazine I had picked up at the hospital. Troy arrived late, around midnight. The door creaked, and I heard him take off his shoes, trying not to make any noise. I waited for him to come in, but he stopped in the corridor, and I heard a quiet sound, the vibration of the phone. "Yes," he said in a whisper, thinking that I couldn't hear. "Tomorrow, after 6. I froze. The magazine fell out of my hands. His voice was not the same as usual, soft, almost affectionate, as when he spoke to me under that oak tree. I stood up, trying not to squeak my chair, and looked out into the corridor. He stood with his back to me, the phone pressed to his ear, and I saw his hand fiddling with his belt as if he was nervous. I said, I'll sort it out. He continued, more quietly. Yes. Fine. Calm. He hung up and turned around, noticing me. His face tensed for a second, but then relaxed into a smile. Jess, why aren't you sleeping? I was waiting for you, I said, trying to keep my voice even. Who called? He shrugged, tucking his phone into his pocket. Client. Some guy with a Ford wants me to look in the morning. At midnight, I crossed my arms, feeling my heart pounding. Yeah, he's boring, Troy said, walking up to me. He hugged me, his hands were warm, but I felt something inside me shrink. Never mind. Let's go to bed. I nodded, allowing him to lead me upstairs, but I didn't sleep that night. I lay there looking at the ceiling, listening to Troy breathe next to me, and thinking about how easy it was for him to lie. It wasn't the first lie, but it was the first I caught. The next day, I was at the hospital checking patient charts when my colleague, Sarah, noticed that I was off. We were sitting in the break room, drinking disgusting coffee from the machine, and she poked me with her elbow. Hey, Jess, where are you? She asked, taking a bite of the donut. I shrugged, looking into my cup. I'm just tired. Children, work, you know. She narrowed her eyes. Yeah, and Troy is late again, right? I looked at her, feeling the blood rush to my cheeks. It works, Sarah. Workshop. Well, yes, of course, she interrupted, rolling her eyes. Look, I'm not getting into this, but when my ex started working late, it turned out that he repairs more than just cars. I laughed, but it was forced. Troy is not like that. She shrugged. Maybe not. But take a closer look, Jess. Guys, they're slippery. I waved it off, but her words stuck in my head like a thorn. That evening, when Troy came home, I noticed how he put the phone down and how quickly he changed the subject when I asked about the day. I started noticing little things, a lipstick mark on the collar he'd thrown in the wash, a smell that wasn't mine, a slight nervousness when I got too close while he was texting. One morning, when Troy left for work, I stayed at home. I had a night shift, and I decided to sort out the laundry. The children were at school, the house was quiet, except for the ticking clock in the kitchen. I was sorting through clothes when I found his shirt, the one he wore the day before. I brought it to my face, and the smell hit me like a slap in the face, sweet, floral alien. It wasn't my lotion, it wasn't my shampoo, it wasn't my scent. I sat on the bedroom floor, holding my shirt, and felt like the world was collapsing. I remembered how he promised me forever, how we kissed in the rain, how he looked at me when Grace was born. I remembered how he laughed with Noah, how he hugged me in the morning, and I couldn't believe that it was all a lie. But I didn't ask him. Not on that day. I folded my shirt, put it in the closet, and went to prepare dinner. I smiled when the children returned, listened to their stories, and kissed them good night. But something died inside me, like a flower that was forgotten to water. That night, when Troy returned, I stood at the sink, washing my hands, even though the dishes were clean. He walked in, threw the keys on the table, and said, "Why are you so quiet?" "I'm just tired," I answered without turning around. He came up, hugged me from behind, and I felt his breath touch my neck. "You think too much, Jess." I turned around, looking into his eyes. "And you, Troy? What are you thinking about?" He frowned, but quickly smiled. "About you. About us. About how lucky we are." I wanted to scream. I wanted to ask about the shirt, about the calls, about everything. But I was silent. I let him kiss me, let him pretend everything was okay. But that night, lying next to him, I looked at the shadows on the ceiling and knew that our love, like a river, had begun to dry up. Autumn was cold, as if nature knew that my world was collapsing. I stood at the sink, scrubbing the pan, although it was already shining. Grace was doing her homework in her room, her music blaring through the closed door. Noah was sitting on the couch, watching some cartoon. His laughter was the only bright spot in the house. Troy hasn't returned yet. As usual, I stopped counting how many times he said, "I'll be late in the workshop," how many times his phone vibrated in his pocket, and how many times I found traces of someone else's life in his things. But today, everything has changed. Today, I learned the truth, not a piece, not a hint, but all of it, naked, like a knife in my chest. It all started with a letter. An ordinary white envelope without a return address lay in the mailbox among bills and advertisements. I opened it, thinking it was just another nonsense, but inside there was a piece of paper folded in half. There is printed text on it without a signature. Troy is sleeping with Caitlin from the Rusty Anchor Bar. It's been 3 years now. Ask him about the trip to Toledo last May. I stood by the box, the wind ruffled my hair, and the words burned my fingers like a hot coal. I reread them, once, twice, until the letters began to blur. There was no screaming, no tears, only silence, heavy, like water in a river after rain. I put the letter in my pocket and returned to the house. Grace shouted from the room that she needed help with math, and I walked towards her, smiling as if nothing had happened. I explained the fractions, straightened her braid, and kissed her forehead. Then she put Noah to bed, reading him a story about a bear who was looking for honey. Everything was as always, but something died inside me. I felt it cold, empty, as if someone had turned off the light. When the children fell asleep, I sat in the kitchen, holding the letter in my hands. I didn't cry. I didn't want to. Instead, I stood up and walked to the mirror in the hallway. My skin was pale, there were shadows under my eyes that weren't there before. I looked at myself, at the woman who loved Troy, bore him children, built a life with him, and I didn't recognize her. She was a stranger, weak, blind. I looked until my eyes began to burn, and then I realized. He cheated on me more than once, with more than one woman. This was not a mistake, not an accident. It was a system that lasted for years. I started digging, quietly, methodically, like a nurse checking symptoms before making a diagnosis. I remembered all his trips, all the urgent orders, all the nights when he returned with someone else's smell. I found old receipts in his drawer for a hotel in Toledo, for dinner for two, for flowers I never brought home. I checked his phone while he was sleeping. He hadn't changed his password, as if he knew I wouldn't dare. There were messages there, not from Caitlin, but from others. I'll see you on Friday. You were great. Tell me you'll come. The names changed, but the tone was the same intimate, light, as if I did not exist. 3 years. Maybe more. I sat on the edge of the bed, looking at Troy sleeping, and thought how he could lie next to me, kiss me, laugh with the children, knowing that he was destroying us. I wanted to wake him up, ask him why, how he could, who I was to him. But I was silent. I returned to the kitchen, poured myself some coffee, and sat until the sky outside turned gray. I didn't cry. I just watched the steam rise from the mug and the shadows crawl across the table. The next day, I went to the Rusty Anchor. The bar was as I expected, dark, with the smell of beer and old wood. Caitlin stood behind the counter, wiping glasses. She was younger than me, with long red hair and a smile that Troy probably liked. I didn't go up to her. I didn't make a scene. I just sat in the corner, drank a Coke, and watched. She laughed with visitors, straightened her hair, and moved like a person who knows that they are looking at her. I saw why he chose her, and I hated myself for this thought. When I got home, Troy was there, playing cards with Noah. Grace was drawing something at the table. Everything looked as it should. Family, home, life. But I saw the cracks. I saw him checking his phone, his smile becoming strained when I looked too long. I saw him lie without even opening his mouth. "Are you okay, Jess?" he asked in the evening when we were washing the dishes. His voice was the same as always, but now I heard the falseness, like a note out of tune. "Yes," I answered without looking at him. "I'm just tired." He nodded as if he believed it and went off to watch TV. I stayed at the sink, looking at my reflection in the window. The woman in the glass was older than I remembered, with eyes that had seen too much. I thought about how easy it would be to walk away, tell him I knew, gather the kids, and start again. But I didn't want to leave. Not like that. Care is too simple, too clean. I wanted him to feel how everything he had built was crumbling. I wanted him to see the bridges burning. I began to think of cheating not as betrayal, but as a weapon. If Troy had been ruining our marriage for years, I could end it with one blow. Not for revenge, not for pain, for freedom. I wanted to destroy what was left, to burn everything to ashes so that there would be no turning back. I didn't know with whom, I didn't know when, but the idea settled in me like a seed waiting for rain. I was distracted at work, but no one noticed. Sarah joked that I looked like I was in love, and I smiled because it was easier than explaining. There was a doctor in the hospital, James, about 35, with kind eyes and a slight smile. He was married, but I saw the way he looked at me when he thought I wasn't noticing. He wasn't Troy, he wasn't charismatic, he wasn't loud, but he had a stability that I no longer felt at home. I started staying late after my shifts, chatting with him in the break room, laughing at his jokes. I didn't flirt, I didn't give hints, but I knew what I was doing. I was getting ready. One evening, he offered to give me a ride home. It was raining, just like when I met Troy, and I agreed. We were sitting in his car, the windows were foggy, and he was talking about his daughter and how she wanted a puppy. I listened, but I thought about how easy it would be to lean closer, to touch his hand, to cross the line. I didn't do this. Not that evening, but I knew I could, and this knowledge was like a key that I kept in my pocket. At home, everything went as before, but I was different. I cooked dinner, kissed the kids, smiled at Troy, but inside I was making a plan. I imagined how I would tell him, how his face would change, how he would realize that he had lost me. I didn't want to scream, I didn't want drama. I wanted him to see that I was no longer his Jess, not the girl in the rain, not the woman who believed in forever. One night I stood in front of the bathroom mirror, looking at myself. My hair was tied up in a bun, my face was without makeup, but my eyes were alive, as if I had woken up after a long sleep. I thought about Grace and Noah, how they would live without the father they knew. I thought about Lena, who would say that I should have fought for the marriage. I thought about Joy, about his lies, about his hands on other women, and I realized that I am not afraid. I was ready to burn everything. Autumn smelled of dampness and the end. I stood at the living room window, watching the rain run down the glass, blurring the reflection of my face. Grace and Noah were at Lena's for the weekend. I insisted they go. The house was empty, too big for what was left of us. Troy was due back in an hour. I knew his schedule better than he did. I knew that he would stop at the workshop, then at the Rusty Anchor, then home, with the smell of whiskey and lies. Today, everything will be different. Today, I will burn everything we have built to the last coal. I prepared for weeks. It was not a flash of anger. It was not blind revenge. It was a calculation, cold as the steel of the scalpel I used in the hospital. I learned the truth about the years of betrayal, dozens of women, each of whom was a game for him, and I a convenient decoration. The letter about Caitlin was just the beginning, but it opened the door behind which I found everything. Messages, receipts, photos that he had not bothered to delete. He didn't just cheat, he lived a different life, where I was nothing more than a shadow. I could have left, I could have filed for divorce, I could have maintained my dignity, but dignity will not give me back the years I gave to him. Dignity won't make him feel what it's like to watch your world burn. I chose two men from the hospital. James, the kind-eyed doctor, was one of them. He was married, but I knew that he would agree. His looks, his light touches when we were alone spoke for themselves. The second was Mike, an orderly, young, with tattoos and a cheeky smile, who flirted with me simply because he could. I didn't love them, I didn't want them. They were tools like a hammer used to break glass. I invited them into our house, into our living room, onto our sofa. I said I want it here today when Troy gets back. They didn't ask questions. James looked guilty, Mike looked excited. I didn't care. The clock was ticking, measuring the last minutes before the end. I wore a dress that Troy loved, a black, tight-fitting one, the one I wore for our 10th anniversary. I let my hair down and put on red lipstick that I hadn't worn in years. I looked in the hallway mirror, and the woman in the reflection was a stranger, not Jess, not a nurse, not a mother. She was a weapon, sharp and ready. James and Mike arrived at 7. I opened the door, let them in, and we didn't waste time talking. The living room was dimly lit. Only a lamp in the corner cast shadows on the walls. I poured them whiskey from Troy's bottle, but didn't drink it myself. I wanted to be sober. I wanted to see everything clearly, like in the operating room. Are you sure? James asked, his voice quiet, almost hesitant. He sat on the sofa, his fingers fiddling with the edge of his glass. I nodded without looking at him. Sure. Mike chuckled, leaning back on the couch. Relax, Doc. She knows what she's doing. I didn't answer. I went to the window, checking the street. Troy's headlights hadn't appeared yet, but I knew he was close. I felt like an animal sensing a storm. I turned to them. My movements were slow, deliberate. I took off my dress, letting it fall to the floor, and the shadows on the walls began to tremble, as if they knew what was coming next. James stood up and walked towards me, his hands touching my shoulders. Mike joined in. His fingers were rougher, but I didn't pull away. I felt nothing, no desire, no shame, no fear, only the goal. I directed them like a director staging a scene. James kissed my neck, Mike kissed my lips, and I responded just enough to make it seem real. But my eyes were on the door. Headlights flashed through the window, and I heard a car door slam. The keys jingled in the lock. I didn't stop. I didn't slow down. I wanted him to see everything. The door opened and Troy froze on the threshold. His face, illuminated by the light of the lamp, was like a painting, first surprise, then disbelief, then rage. He dropped the keys. They clinked on the floor like a shot in the silence. What the hell, Jess? His voice was hoarse, as if air was stuck in his throat. I pulled away from James and Mike, slowly looking into his eyes. My skin burned under their hands, but I was calm, like a lake before a storm. You know, Troy, I said, and my voice was hard as stone. You know. James retreated, muttering something about how he had to go. Mike stayed, his grin unwavering, as if it were a game. Troy stepped forward, his fists clenched, and I thought he was going to hit someone, then me, the wall. But he stopped, his gaze darting between us, as if he was trying to figure out if this was real. Get out, he said, looking at James and Mike. His voice trembled, but there was steel in it. Now. Mike shrugged, picked up his jacket, and walked out, whistling. James mumbled an apology without looking at me and followed. The door slammed, and we were left alone. Troy looked at me, his eyes dark as the sky before a storm. You, he choked, unable to find words. You planned this. I nodded without looking away. Yes. For what? His voice broke, and I saw the pain, the real one, the one I wanted. Why, Jess? Because you destroyed us, I said quietly. For years. Caitlin. I know everything, Troy, and I wanted you to feel what it's like. He shook his head, as if he could erase what he had seen. You're sick. It's not you. It's me, I answered, and there was not a drop of doubt in my voice. The one you made me. He stepped towards me, and for a second I thought he was going to grab me, but he stopped. Get out, he said, his voice low, like a growl. I'm filing for divorce. You don't live here anymore. I nodded as if it was expected. Fine. I picked up the dress from the floor and put it on, taking my time, feeling his gaze on me. I walked past him, took the bag that I had packed in advance, and went out into the rain. He didn't stop me. I returned to the house that night because Lena had not yet brought the children, and I needed to pick up my things. The rain had stopped, but the air was heavy, as if the sky knew what had happened. Troy was sitting in the kitchen with a bottle of whiskey in front of him, but he wasn't drinking. His eyes were red, but not from tears, from rage, from pain, from something he couldn't undo. I walked in without looking at him and started packing my things in the bedroom. My movements were mechanical: clothes, a toothbrush, a photo of Grace and Noah from the lake. I didn't take anything that would remind me of him. I heard him stand up and his steps approaching, but I didn't turn around. You destroyed everything, he said, standing in the doorway. His voice was as empty as a house. You started, I answered without looking up. I just finished. He was silent, and I felt his gaze like a knife. I closed my bag and turned to him. His face was gray, as if life had drained from him. I expected him to scream, hit, do something, but he just watched. Children, he said finally, what will I tell them? The truth, I answered. Or lie. You are a master at this. He jerked as if from a slap in the face, but did not respond. I walked past him, my steps echoing in the silence. I stopped at the door, looking at my reflection in the glass. The woman there was calm, strong, but empty. I opened the door and walked out, leaving him with the ashes of what was our home. The night was cold, and I was sitting in a car parked near Lena's house. I didn't go to her. I didn't want to see her questions, her pity. I looked at the traces of rain on the windshield, at the shadows that moved in the light of the headlights. I didn't feel victory. I didn't feel relief. Only emptiness, like a river that has dried up. I burned the bridges as I wanted, but now there was no way forward or back. Just me, the mirror, and silence. Winter came early, as if it wanted to freeze everything I left behind. I sat in the car outside the courthouse, watching the snowfall on the windshield, turning into dirty streaks. My state-appointed lawyer was inside, but I didn't go with him. I knew what would happen. Troy would get custody of Grace and Noah, the house, the car, our lives. I didn't fight. I didn't see the point. If I destroyed everything with my own hands, why cling to the rubble? Life, I thought, would put everything in its place. Or he won't place it. I didn't care. Troy kicked me out the night he saw me with James and Mike. His words, "You don't live here anymore," sounded like an echo in my head, but I didn't argue. I left, taking only a bag of clothes and a photograph of the children. I didn't cry, I didn't scream, I didn't beg. I just walked away like it was the only way. Lena invited me to stay with her, but I refused. Her new man, her smiles, her questions, it was all too much. I rented a room in a motel on the outskirts, paid for it with money from night shifts at the hospital. The room smelled damp and lonely, but I didn't complain. It was mine. Troy filed for divorce a week later. His lawyer, a polished guy in an expensive suit, sent me papers where everything was written out. He wants full custody, a house, alimony. I read the documents over coffee at the diner, the same one where I had once met Troy. I signed them without hesitation. The lawyer they gave me tried to object, saying that I could fight, that the court would take into account my work, my role as a mother. But I shook my head. "Let him take it," I said. He looked at me like I was crazy, but I didn't explain. How can I explain that I don't want a piece of what I burned myself? The trial was quick, like an injection into a vein. The hall smelled of wax and old paper, and the judge, an elderly woman with tired eyes, leafed through the documents without looking at us. Troy sat across from me, wearing the shirt I had once ironed. His face was stony, but I could see his fingers gripping the edge of the table, as if he was afraid that I would change my mind. I haven't changed my mind. My lawyer read out my statement. I renounce guardianship, the house, everything. I sat looking out the window, where the snow was falling slowly, like ash. The judge asked if I was sure, and I nodded without looking up. Her voice was soft, almost sympathetic, but I could feel the glances of others, lawyer Troy, the secretary, even the cleaning lady in the corner. They all thought the same thing. What kind of mother abandons her children? I didn't make excuses. Let them think. Troy got it all. Custody, a home, the right to decide when I see Grace and Noah. The judge ordered me to pay alimony, a ridiculous amount because my salary as a nurse barely covered the motel rent. I didn't mind. When she banged the hammer, I stood up and walked out without looking at Troy. I heard him say something to his lawyer, but I couldn't make out the words. I didn't want to. It was cold outside, and I stood by the car, looking at my footprints in the snow. They were deep, but I knew that within an hour they would be covered, like me, like everything. I haven't seen the children since that night. Troy forbade me to come, said they didn't want to see me. I didn't argue. Grace must have hated me. Her 7-year-old rage was as sharp as a knife. Noah, quiet as always, would simply remain silent, and that would be worse. I wrote letters to them, but did not send them. The words seemed empty, like myself. What could I say? Sorry for destroying our family. I'm sorry I didn't fight for you. I didn't know how to be a mother who had lost everything. Lena called and shouted that I was crazy, that I had to fight for the children. You are their mother, Jessica. How could you? I listened in silence, staring at the motel wall where the wallpaper was peeling like skin. When she finished, I said, "I made a choice." She hung up, and I knew she wouldn't call again. That night, I returned to the motel, but I could not sit in the room. I went to the house, our house, which was now only his. I parked across the street, looking at the lighted windows. Grace was probably reading in her room, her silhouette flashing behind the curtain. Noah was watching TV, his laugh probably still ringing in the living room. Troy was there with them, their father, their world. And I was here, outside like a ghost. I got out of the car, the snow crunching under my feet. I walked up to the fence, touched it with my fingers, and the cold penetrated my bones. I saw my reflection in the dark window, a pale face, empty eyes. If I lost everything, why don't I cry? I thought. I was waiting for tears, waiting for pain, waiting for something that would say that I was still alive. But there was nothing, only silence like a river that has frozen. I remembered how Grace laughed when we made pancakes, how Noah drew me flowers on Mother's Day. I remembered how Troy looked at me in the rain, promising forever. I remembered how I burned it all, how I stood in the living room with two men, knowing that he would see. I did it to destroy him, but I destroyed myself. And now I couldn't even cry. I returned to the motel and lay down on the bed without undressing. The ceiling was stained like a map of someone else's life. I thought about the trial, about the humiliation that was supposed to break me. But it didn't break. I was already broken, a long time ago, even when I found that letter, when I realized that Troy had been lying to me for years. The trial was just a formality, like a signature on a gravestone. Why didn't I fight? I asked myself. I could hire a lawyer, prove that I'm a good mother, that I deserve Grace and Noah. But I didn't believe it. I saw myself in the mirror, a woman who destroyed her family, who chose revenge instead of love. How could I be their mother? How could I teach them good when I myself became evil? I thought about Joy, about how he would raise them, how he would lie to them about me. He will say that I abandoned them, that I did not love them, and they will believe because he is their father, and I am nobody. I wasn't afraid of it. I wasn't afraid of anything. Life, as I told myself, will put everything in its place. If Grace and Noah want to find me, they will find me. If not, I'll accept it. I have already accepted everything. I stood up and walked over to the small mirror above the sink. My hair was tangled and my skin was gray. I looked into my eyes, looking for at least something: regret, guilt, love. But there was only emptiness, like snow outside the window. If I lost everything, why don't I cry? I thought again. Maybe because tears are for those who still hope. But I didn't hope. I was a river that dried up, a mirror that cracked, a shadow that disappeared. I lay back down and closed my eyes. Snow was falling outside the window, covering the city, my footprints, my life. I didn't fight. I didn't cry. I was just waiting for the emptiness to become home. The fall began imperceptibly, like a crack in glass. After the trial, I tried to hold on. I worked night shifts at the hospital, sipped coffee to stay awake, smiled at patients as if my life had not fallen apart. But I saw their looks: colleagues, Sarah, even James, who avoided me after that night. They knew. Rumors in the town spread like wildfire. Jessica, the one who slept with two men in front of her husband. Jessica, the one who abandoned the children. I didn't make excuses. Some perverted sense of pride held me. I made a choice, and I will carry it. But the money was running out. The alimony I paid Troy took up half of my salary. Motel, food, gas the rest. I started missing shifts because I couldn't get out of bed. I couldn't look at myself in the mirror in the hospital locker room. I was fired 3 months after the trial. Unreliable, the manager said, and I didn't argue. I was unreliable for work, for children, for myself. I took on part-time jobs, washing dishes in a diner, cleaning the office, delivering leaflets. But this was not enough. I moved into a rooming house on the edge of town that smelled of urine and despair. There were women like me, and those who fell even lower with empty eyes, with needles in their veins. I stayed away, but their life seeped into mine like water into a sinking boat. The first time I tried drugs was in a rooming house. A woman named Rita, with gray locks and a toothless smile, offered me a pill. "Relax," she said, and I took it because I saw no reason to refuse. The pill was bitter, but it took away everything: pain, thoughts, emptiness. I was free for a few hours. I knew it was a trap, but I returned to Rita again and again. The tablets became powder, the powder became injections. I wasn't a drug addict, I told myself. I was just surviving. The streets became my home when the shelter closed for renovations. I slept in gateways, in abandoned buildings, under a bridge by the river. My backpack was my only anchor, but even that was stolen one night while I was sleeping. The photo of Grace and Noah disappeared, and I sat on the pavement, looking at my hands, thinking that this was the end. But I didn't cry. If I lost everything, why don't I cry? I asked myself, but there was no answer. Only the river, only the cold, only the shadows. I wandered around the city like a ghost. People looked away when I asked for change. I saw my reflection in shop windows: dirty hair, sunken cheeks, eyes like those of a dead man. I was nobody. Jessica, nurse, mother, wife, disappeared. All that was left was a shell walking through the snow, leaving traces that no one would notice. I met Oliver under the bridge where the river was loudest. He sat on an old box, wearing a coat patched with tape, reading a book without a cover. His face was wrinkled, but his eyes were alive, as if he knew something that I didn't. I sat a few meters away, hugging my knees to my chest, and looked at the water. I didn't want to talk, I didn't want anything. But he spoke first. "The river is honest," he said, without looking up from his book. "She doesn't lie like people do." I looked at him, expecting a sermon or a mockery, but he simply turned the page. "What does it mean?" I asked, my voice hoarse, as if I hadn't spoken in days. He closed the book, placing his finger on the page. "So she sees you, not who you pretend to be, but who you are." I laughed, bitterly, as if he was joking. "Then she sees trash." He smiled, his teeth crooked but kind. "Garbage is what is thrown away, and you're still here, so you're not trash." I turned away, feeling his words cling to something inside. I didn't want them to cling. I wanted to drown in the river, in silence, in emptiness. But he continued to speak, his voice low as the rumble of water. Joseph Campbell said, "A hero dies to be reborn," he quoted, looking at the river. "You died, yes, but this is not the end. This is just the beginning." I shook my head. "I'm not a hero. I'm nobody." He looked at me, and his eyes were like a mirror in which I did not want to see myself. Nobody is also someone. You just don't know who yet. I was silent, looking at my reflection in the water. It was broken like glass, like me. But there was something else in him, a shadow of who I was, who I could become. I didn't believe Oliver. I didn't believe in his quotes and his philosophy. But his words remained like footprints in the snow that did not immediately fall asleep. We started talking more often. Oliver was homeless like me, but not broken. He was a philosophy teacher until life threw him to the sidelines. He didn't tell me how, and I didn't ask. He carried books in his backpack, old, tattered ones, and read them as if they were his home. He talked about Nietzsche, about Camus, about Campbell, and I listened, not always understanding, but feeling how his words filled the void. One day he gave me a book, The Hero with a Thousand Faces. "Read it," he said. "Find yourself." I haven't read it. I held it in my hands like a talisman, as a reminder that he sees something in me that I don't see. I didn't want to be a hero. I wanted to be nobody, but Oliver didn't let me drown. I kept falling. Drugs became a part of me, like breathing. I took them from Rita, from others, and paid with small change that I collected. They gave me silence, but took away what was left of me. I knew this was the beginning of the end, but I couldn't stop. I was on a broken staircase, and every step led downwards. But Oliver was there, under the bridge, with his books and his words. He did not save me, did not preach, did not condemn me. He just was. And his words, "A hero dies to be reborn," sounded in my head like a river that does not stop, even when it freezes. I looked at my reflection in the water, at the shadows that moved in its depths. I didn't cry. I didn't fight, but I listened to the river, listened to Oliver, and somewhere, deep down, I began to think that maybe I wasn't dead yet. Not really. The snow fell slowly, like ash, settling on my torn coat. I was sitting on the river bank, under the very bridge where Oliver read his books. My hands were shaking, not from the cold, but from something deeper that I couldn't name. Last night I saw my father in a dream, his face, gray as old asphalt, his eyes empty, like the bottles he left in the kitchen. He didn't say anything, just watched, and I woke up with the feeling that he was still here, inside me, like a shadow that I couldn't shake. I hadn't thought about him for years, but now he was everywhere, in the river, in the snow, in my reflection. I realized that I lived like him, and this frightened me more than the cold, than hunger, than emptiness. My father died when I was 27. I was already married to Troy. Grace was 3. Noah had just been born. His death was not unexpected. He had been drinking as long as I remembered, and his liver had given up, like an old engine that no one had repaired. I didn't cry at the funeral. Lena sobbed, holding my hand, but I stood looking at the coffin and thought that he was finally free. Or maybe it was I who wanted to be free from him, from his silence, from his life, which had always been a mystery to me. We were never close. He was tall, with stiff hands and a voice that sounded like gravel under the wheels. When I was little, I was afraid of him, but not because he hit me or screamed. He was simply distant, like a star that you can see but cannot touch. He worked at a factory, repaired cars on weekends, and drank in the evenings. Lena said that he was different before I was born, that he laughed, sang, danced with her to the radio. I didn't believe it. My father was a shadow, a man who looked through me as if I were glass. I remember sitting on the porch. I was about 10 years old, waiting for him to come home from work. I wanted to show him a drawing, a house, a tree, the sun, everything, as they taught in school. He arrived late, smelling of whiskey and butter, and I ran up to him, shoving the paper under his nose. "Dad, look," he looked, but his eyes were empty, as if he saw neither the house nor the sun. "Okay," he said, and went into the kitchen, where the bottle was waiting. I stood on the porch, holding the drawing, feeling like something inside me was cracking. I didn't show him the drawings after that. Lena tried to be a bridge between us. She said, "He loves you, Jess. He just doesn't know how to show it." I nodded, but didn't believe it. Love is not silence, not emptiness, not the smell of whiskey. Love is what I saw in other families, where fathers hugged their daughters, laughed, and listened. My father was lonely, even with us, and I grew up feeling lonely next to him. As I got older, the alienation became a wall. I avoided him, he avoided me. We could sit at dinner without saying a word, only Lena chatting, trying to fill the silence. I left home at 17 when I met Troy, and my father didn't say anything when I packed my things. Lena cried, he simply nodded, as if I were a neighbor and not a daughter. I thought that when I left, I would leave him behind, but he was in me like a thorn that could not be pulled out. When he died, I didn't go to the hospital. Lena begged, but I refused. I didn't want to see him connected to the tubes. I didn't want to hear his last words, if there were any. I stayed home and rocked Noah while Grace played in the garden. Troy asked why I didn't go, and I said, "He's not my father." Troy looked at me as if he wanted to object, but remained silent. He always knew when not to interfere. At the funeral, I stood by the coffin, looking at his face, softened by death. He looked younger, calmer, as if he had finally found peace. Lena held my hand. Her tears dripped onto my dress. I didn't cry. I thought about how he looked at my drawing, how he was silent, how he drank, how he died alone, and I hated him for it. But now, sitting by the river, I realized that it was not only him that I hated. I hated myself because I became the same. Lena was different. After her father's death, she came to life, like a flower that was watered after a drought. She met Paul, a man with a kind smile and hands that were always fixing things in her house. She laughed like a girl, wore bright dresses, and traveled with him to the lakes. I saw her photos on social networks, Lena on the pier, Lena with a glass of wine, Lena happy, and I hated her. Not because she found happiness, but because she could. She lost her husband, but did not lose herself. She didn't follow her father into his darkness like I did. I didn't call her after the trial. She tried to contact me, left messages, sent letters, but I didn't answer. I couldn't hear her voice, full of pity. I couldn't see her life, which shone while mine faded. She was the mother who chose the light, and I was the daughter who chose the shadow. I hated her for that, but I hated myself more for not being able to be like her. I sat by the river, and the snow fell on my lap like my father's ashes. I remembered his life, his death, his loneliness. He was a man who withdrew into himself and never returned. He drank to forget, was silent so as not to feel, died so as not to live. And I realized that I was following him. My drugs were like his whiskey, my nights under the bridge were like his evenings in the kitchen, my silence was like his gaze through me. I didn't die like him, but I was dead inside, and that was worse. If I lost everything, why don't I cry? I asked myself, but now I know the answer. I didn't cry because those who are still alive cry, and I was ashes, like my father, like snow, like a river that froze. I followed him into death, not physical, but the one that lives in the eyes, in the hands, in the heart. I became his shadow, his echo, his end. Oliver found me by the river. He sat down next to her, without saying a word, and opened his book. His coat was wet with snow, but he was not shivering. He was like a river calm, unchanging, even in a storm. I looked at him, at his hands stained with ink, at his eyes that saw more than I could understand. "Why don't you give up?" I asked, my voice as hoarse as the wind. He smiled without looking up from his book. "Because giving up is not the end. It's just a pause." I shook my head. "I'm not taking a pause. I'm the end." He closed the book and looked at me. "You're not the end, Jess. You are the beginning, but you must die to be born." I remembered his words about Campbell, about the hero who dies to be reborn. I didn't believe it, but his voice was like an anchor keeping me from the river. "My father died," I said, saying it out loud for the first time, "and I die like him." Oliver nodded, as if this was nothing new. "Maybe you are following his path, but you can choose another one." I looked at the river, at my reflection, broken by ice. I don't know how. He handed me the book, the same one, The Hero with 1,000 Faces. "Start here," he said. "Find yourself." I took the book. Its pages were cold as snow. I didn't open it, but I held it as if it could keep me from falling. I thought about my father, about his life, about his death. I thought about Lena, about her light, about her happiness. I thought about Grace and Noah and how they were growing up without me. And I thought about myself, about the woman who had become ashes but was still breathing. I sat by the river, and the snow fell, covering my tracks. I didn't cry, but for the first time in a long time, I felt something, not pain, not guilt, but a spark, weak, like a star in the daytime sky. I held Oliver's book, listened to the river, and thought that maybe I wasn't dead yet. Maybe I can find another path, not the one my father chose, not the one that leads to death. Maybe I can become the hero Oliver spoke of, the one who dies to be born. But for now, I was ashes, a shadow, a broken ladder. And the river looked at me, knowing everything I had lost and everything I could still find. I sat in an abandoned building, the wind whistling through the broken windows, clutching the backpack Oliver had helped me return to my chest. Inside was his book, as tattered as my life, and a couple of cigarettes that I didn't smoke, but kept as a reminder that I could. It was morning, but the sky was gray, just like my thoughts. I tried to remember the last time I ate, when I slept, when I felt human, and then I heard steps. Harris walked in, his boots crunching on broken glass. His face, usually calm, was tense, and I knew he had news. He always found me as if I were his duty, which he could not abandon. "Jess," he said, stopping a few steps away. His breath swirled in the cold air. "We need to talk." I looked at him, feeling something inside me shrinking. "What again?" My voice was hoarse, like an old radio. He squatted down to be at eye level with me. "Troy," he said quietly. "He died. Last night. Heart attack in a dream." I froze, looking at him as if he was speaking a foreign language. "Troy, dead. I expected to feel something: pain, relief, tears, but there was nothing. Only snow outside the window and silence in my chest. "How do you know?" I asked, although it didn't matter. "His neighbor called an ambulance, but it was too late," Harris said. "I thought you should know." "Sorry, Jess." I nodded, not knowing what he was apologizing for. He stood up and shuffled around, as if he wanted to say something else, but changed his mind. "If anything, I'm at the station," he said, and left, leaving me with his words that hung in the air like smoke. "Troy is dead." I repeated this in my head, tasting the words. They were bitter, but empty, like the bottle my father was finishing in the kitchen. I sat looking at my hands, dirty, with broken nails, and thought about him, about his smile, about his lies, about his hands that once held me in the rain. I hated him. I loved him. And now he was dead, and I was still here, alive, although it seemed to me that it was the other way around. I didn't know how it happened, but a day later I stood at the entrance to the morgue. I didn't plan to go there. After Harris's words, I wandered around the city, slept under a bridge, smoked other people's cigarette butts, trying to figure out what to do with this news. But my feet themselves led me here, to a gray building that smelled of disinfection and death. I stood at the door, the snow melting in my hair, and thought that I could leave. But she didn't leave. It was cold inside, just like my heart. The morgue worker, an elderly man with tired eyes, looked at me as if he knew who I was. "Are you visiting Troy Walker?" he asked, leafing through the papers. I nodded, not trusting my voice. He led me down a corridor where the lamps buzzed like flies. I felt the walls pressing in and the air getting thicker. He opened the door, and I entered a room that smelled of metal and formaldehyde. Troy was lying on the table, under a white sheet that hid everything except his face. I stopped, not coming closer. His skin was gray, like asphalt after rain, but his features were the same: sharp cheekbones, light stubble, hair that he never cut on time. He looked asleep, but I knew he wouldn't wake up. I expected to feel something: anger, love, emptiness. But there was only an echo, as if I was shouting into an empty room. I came closer. My steps were as quiet as snow. I looked at him, at the man who was my first, my everything, my end. "You died, but I didn't," I said quietly, my words dissolving in the cold air, although it seemed to me that it was the other way around. I remembered his laughter, his hands, his lies. I remembered how he looked at me that night when I destroyed our marriage, how his eyes burned with pain and rage. I hated him for what he did to us, for the years of cheating, for stealing my life. But I loved him, even now, even here, in this cold morgue, where his heart no longer beat. I loved the boy who kissed me in the rain, the father who rocked Grace on his lap, the man who promised me forever, and I hated myself for it. I didn't cry. I stood looking at him and thought about Grace and Noah. They didn't invite me to the funeral. Harris said they decided for themselves: Grace, now 17, hard as a rock, and Noah, 15, quiet as a shadow. They didn't want me there. I didn't blame them. How could I? I was the one who left, who destroyed their world, who became a ghost. But it cut deeper than I expected, deeper than the knife. I left the morgue, the snow crunching under my feet. I went to the river, to the bridge, where Oliver was reading his books. He was there, as always, with a tattered book and eyes that had seen too much. I sat down next to her, without saying a word, and looked at the water, black and slow, like my thoughts. "He died," I said finally, my voice as fragile as ice. Oliver nodded without looking up from his book. "And how do you feel?" I looked at my reflection in the river, broken like glass. Hatred, love, nothing. He closed the book and looked at me. "That's life, Jess. All at once, and nothing." I shook my head. I should have died. Not him. I was the one who broke. Oliver smiled, his teeth crooked but kind. "You're not broken. You're cracked, and cracks are what light passes through." I didn't answer. I thought about Joy, about his death, about his life, about our love, which was real until it became ashes. I thought about Grace and Noah, how they were growing up without me, how I didn't go to his funeral because they didn't want me. And I thought about myself, about the woman who was still breathing, despite everything. That night, I sat under the bridge, looking at the river. The snow fell, covering my tracks, but I did not disappear. I held Oliver's book, not opening it, but feeling its weight in my hands. I thought about Joy, about his heart that stopped, about his eyes that will never open again. I thought about my hatred, about my love, about my life, which was still mine, even if I didn't know how to live it. I didn't cry, but I felt something moving inside me, like a river under the ice, like light in the cracks. Troy died, but I didn't. And this was the beginning, or the end, or something in between. I didn't know. But I sat, listened to the river, and for the first time in a long time, I thought that maybe I could still find myself. The snow crunched under my boots like bones as I walked towards the church. The sky was heavy and gray, as if it were mourning Troy instead of me. I shouldn't have been here. Grace and Noah made it clear that they didn't want me at the funeral. Harris conveyed their words, gently but firmly, as always. But I couldn't help but come. Not after the morgue, not after I saw him dead, gray, empty. I hated him, I loved him, and this storm inside me drove me forward, like a wind that cannot be stopped. I didn't know what I would say, I didn't know why I was going. But my legs moved, and I did not resist. The church was old, with peeling paint and stained glass windows that were fading in the winter light. I stood at the entrance, looking at the people who came in, neighbors, Troy's colleagues, faces I knew, and those I had never seen. They were dressed in black, their heads bowed, their whispers dissolved in the cold air. I felt their gazes without even meeting their eyes. "It's her," they whispered. I knew. The one who destroyed the family. I gritted my teeth, wrapped myself in my tattered coat, and stepped inside. Inside it smelled of wax and incense, like in childhood, when Lena dragged me to work. The shops were filled, people sat shoulder to shoulder, their faces masks of grief. I stopped at the door, my hands were shaking, but not from the cold. Grace and Noah were in front, at the altar, next to the coffin. Grace, tall, with her hair tightly braided, stood straight as a soldier, her eyes dry but red. Noah, still a boy despite being 15, looked at the floor, his shoulders shaking. They didn't see me. No one saw until I stepped forward. Footsteps echoed in the silence and heads began to turn. I felt their gazes like needles, but I didn't stop. I reached a passage where the light from the stained glass windows fell on the floor, painting it in dull colors. Grace looked up and her face changed shock, anger, pain. Noah looked after him, his gaze was softer, but just as distant. I stood a few steps away from them, looking at the coffin where Troy lay, hidden by polished wood and flowers. "Jess," Lena's voice, sharp as a slap in the face, came from the first bench. She stood up, her face was pale, but I didn't look at her. I looked at Grace, at Noah, at the coffin. "You didn't call me," I said, and my voice was louder than I expected, trembling but firm. The silence in the church became heavy, like the snow that was falling outside. "You crossed me out as if I were nobody." Grace stepped forward, her eyes blazing. "You left on your own," she said, her voice as sharp as a knife. "You abandoned us." I shook my head, feeling the words bursting out of me, confused, angry, sincere. "He broke me." I pointed my finger at the coffin, my hand trembling. "Troy, he lied, cheated, and destroyed us for years. I was your mother, I loved you, but he took everything, and I broke. Yes, I did something terrible, but I was broken by him." Noah looked at me, his eyes were wet, but he was silent. Grace clenched her fists, her lips trembled, but she did not back down. "You can't blame him for everything," she said, her voice quieter but firmer. "You chose this. You left." I laughed, bitterly, as if someone had squeezed the air out of me. "Did you choose? Do you think I wanted this? I wanted to be with you, Noah, with you, Grace. But I didn't know how. He took my life and you. You wrote me off like I didn't matter." Lena stepped towards me. Her hand touched my shoulder, but I stepped back. "Jessica, stop," she said, her voice pleading. "Not here." "No," I turned to her, my eyes burning. "You don't understand, Lena. You are happy, you live, and I died, like my father, like Troy. But I'm still here, and I want them to know." People whispered. Their voices were like the rustling of leaves. Someone stood up. Someone coughed. But I didn't look at them. I looked at Grace, at Noah, at the coffin. I loved him, I said, my voice breaking, but I didn't stop. I hated him, but I loved him. And I love you. But you crossed me out. Grace shook her head, her eyes filled with tears, but she didn't let them fall. We didn't want you here, she said, and her words were like a blow. You are not our mother. Not now. I froze, feeling her words cut deeper than I expected. Noah looked at the floor, his hands gripping the hem of his jacket. I wanted to go up to them, hug them, tell them that I was still their mother, that I was still here. But I couldn't. Their views, their silence, their pain were a wall that I myself built. I turned to the coffin, looking at the flowers that hid his face. You broke me, Troy, I said quietly, as if he could hear. But I broke myself more. And I pay for it every day. The silence was deafening. I felt their gazes, felt their condemnation, their pity, their anger. I turned and walked towards the exit, my steps being the only sound in the church. Nobody stopped me. Not Grace, not Noah, not Lena. The door creaked as I walked out, and the cold hit my face like a slap in the face. Outside, the snow fell thicker, covering my tracks as if I had never been here. I walked without looking back, feeling the storm inside me subside, leaving only emptiness. I said everything I wanted, but it did not bring relief. Grace and Noah were right. I left, I chose, I destroyed. But I was their mother, and their refusal to see me cut like a knife that I had thrust into. I walked to the river, to the bridge, where Oliver was waiting for me, as always, with a book in his hands. He looked at me, his eyes were warm despite the cold. You did what you had to do, he said without asking. I sat down next to him, looking at the water. I don't know, I answered, my voice as weak as snow. I wanted them to hear. But they hate me. He nodded, turning the page. Hate is also love, Jess? Just upside down. I looked at my reflection in the river, broken like a stained glass window in a church. I didn't cry, but I felt like something inside me was cracking, like ice in the spring. I left amid silence, but my words remained like footprints in the snow that didn't immediately fall asleep. And maybe one day Grace and Noah will hear them, or they won't hear. But I told the truth, my truth, and that was all I had left. I lay in a ditch by the river, where the mud mixed with the ice, sticking to my coat, to my hair, to my skin. A bottle of cheap whiskey, empty, lay nearby, its smell still hanging in the air, bitter and acrid. I couldn't feel my arms, legs, faced the cold, took everything, like a thief who leaves no trace. My eyes were open, but I saw only darkness, thick as a river under ice. I didn't know how long I lay here, hours, days, eternity. I didn't know if I was alive, and I didn't care. After Troy's funeral, something completely broke in me. Grace and her words, "You are not our mother," were like a knife that I could not pull out. I left the church, but its silence, its glances, its walls followed me like shadows. I drank to forget, took drugs so as not to feel, wandered so as not to think. But the river was always nearby, whispering, calling, and I finally answered. I lay down in this ditch, drunk, frostbitten, ready to leave. Dying was easy. It was like closing your eyes and not opening them again. I didn't hear footsteps, didn't see light, but I felt warmth. Someone's hands, rough but strong, lifted me and pulled me out of the mud. I wanted to resist, but I didn't have the strength. A voice, low and familiar, broke through the darkness. Jess, hold on. I'm here. Oliver. His face was blurry, like a reflection in a river, but his eyes, alive and tenacious, held me like an anchor. He wrapped me in his coat, which smelled of dampness and books, and dragged me somewhere. His breathing was heavy but even. I tried to tell him to leave me, to let me die, but the words stuck in my throat like ice. He led me to an abandoned warehouse where we sometimes hid from the wind. It was cold there, but not as cold as in the ditch. He lit a fire in an old barrel. Sparks rose to the ceiling like stars. I sat there, trembling, while he took off my wet boots, rubbed my hands. His fingers were warm despite everything. I looked at him, at his wrinkled face, at his book lying in the corner, and did not understand why he was doing this. For what? My voice was weak, like the whisper of a river. I'm finished, Oliver. Leave me alone. He looked at me. His eyes were like a mirror in which I was afraid to see myself. Dying is easy, Jess, he said, his voice firm but soft, like a river in summer. Living, that's what's scary. I shook my head, feeling the cold inside me fighting against the warmth of the fire. I can't live. I'm nobody. I closed my eyes. His words were like stones falling into water, creating circles that I didn't want to see. I thought about the ditch, how easy it would be to stay there, how quiet it would be under the snow. But Oliver didn't let me leave. He was here with his books, his words, his faith in me, which I did not deserve. He brought me food, a candy bar he found in his backpack, and a bottle of water, cloudy but clean. Eat, he said, pushing the bar into my hands. I looked at him like he was poisoned, but he didn't back down. Eat, Jess, or I'll put it in your mouth. I took the bar, my fingers trembling like leaves in the wind. I took a bite, and the taste sweet, sticky was foreign, like something from another life. I ate slowly, feeling the food settle in my stomach, how it brought me back to a reality I wanted to forget. Oliver watched without saying a word, and I knew he wouldn't let me stop. When I finished eating, he took me to the river. There was an old barn where we sometimes hid, and in it was a rusty barrel of water that someone had left behind. Wash yourself, he said, handing me a piece of soap, small as a pebble. You smell like death. I laughed, bitterly, but he didn't smile. I took the soap and went to the barrel. The water was ice cold, but I took off my coat, shirt, and began to rub my skin. The mud was coming off, leaving red streaks, and I felt the cold creeping into my bones. But I continued because Oliver was watching, because I didn't want to be the one who smelled of death. I washed my hair, face, hands, and the water became cloudy like my life. When I finished, Oliver gave me his old jacket, dry, smelling of him. Now look at yourself, he said, pointing to a piece of mirror leaning against the wall of the barn. It was cracked like me, but it was still reflective. I approached reluctantly, afraid of what I would see. My skin was pale, my hair was wet, my eyes were empty but alive. I wasn't the Jess who kissed Troy in the rain, or the one who sang lullabies to Grace. But I was somebody. I was here, I breathed, I looked, and it was more than I expected. I don't know how to live, I said, without looking up from the mirror. My voice was quiet but honest. Oliver stood next to me, his shadow falling on my reflection. Nobody knows, Jess, but you are starting. This is already something. I looked at him, at his face, which had seen too much, but was still smiling. Why don't you leave me? I asked, feeling like something inside was cracking, like ice under the sun. Because you are not trash, he said, and his words were like a river flowing through me. You are a hero who does not yet know his story. I turned away from the mirror, feeling the warmth of fire, food, water settling in me, like a seed that could grow. I didn't believe in heroes, I didn't believe in stories, but I believed Oliver because he was here, because he pulled me out of the ditch, because he saw me when I couldn't see myself. I sat by the fire, looking at the sparks that rose to the ceiling. Snow was falling outside the window, but I no longer wanted to be part of it. I ate, washed, and looked in the mirror. They were small steps, but they were mine. Oliver was sitting next to me, reading his book, and I knew he wouldn't leave. I thought about Grace and Noah, about Troy, about Lena, about my father. I thought about the ditch, how close I had been to death, and how Oliver said that living was scary. He was right. Dying was easy. Living, that's what scared me. But I sat here, alive, and for the first time in a long time, it seemed not the end, but the beginning. Spring came quietly, like a whisper, breaking through the snow that still clung to the ground. I sat in the shelter, in a room with peeling walls and the smell of bleach, looking at my hands, clean but still shaking. The shelter wasn't a home, but it was a roof, a bed, a chance that I didn't deserve, but that Oliver forced me to take. He brought me here after that night in the ditch, when I was closer to death than to life. He didn't ask if I wanted to, he just said, "Let's go." And I went because there was something in his eyes that I could not resist the belief that I was not finished yet. The first days at the shelter were like walking on glass. I felt like a stranger among others, women with empty eyes, men with hunched shoulders, children who did not laugh. I kept to myself, sat in the corner of the dining room, ate soup that smelled like hospital, and listened to the rain hitting the windows. But Oliver came every day, brought books, talked about Nietzsche, about Campbell, about how I should find my way. "Baby steps, Jess," he said, and I nodded, not believing, but trying. I started working in the shelter kitchen. It wasn't a dream job washing pots, chopping onions, wiping down tables until your hands smelled like detergent. But it was something. I got up at 5, put on an apron, listened to the cooks squabble, and did my job. My movements were slow, hesitant, like those of a person learning to walk again. But every day I returned because the kitchen was warm, because there was a rhythm that kept me afloat. Then I started cleaning, sweeping floors, changing sheets, cleaning bathrooms where the mirrors were as cracked as I was. I avoided my reflection, but sometimes I caught it in the corner of my eye-pale skin, hair pulled back into a messy bun, eyes that were beginning to see something other than emptiness. I wasn't the Jess who sang Grace's lullabies, but I was someone, and that was enough to continue. The letter arrived in April, when the rain was pouring down as if the sky had decided to wash away the entire city. I was in the kitchen peeling potatoes when the woman from the administration, Mrs. Clark, called me. "Jessica, there's a letter for you," she said, holding out a white envelope, crumpled but intact. I froze, holding the knife, feeling my heart pounding as if it knew what was inside. On the envelope was my name, written in Grace's neat handwriting. I recognized it immediately, the same one that was on her school notebooks when I checked her homework. I put the envelope in my apron pocket without opening it. I wasn't ready. I finished my shift, washed my hands, feeling how the water washed away not only dirt, but also fear. In my small room, small, with a narrow bed and a window from which one could see the river, I sat down on the mattress and took out a letter. My fingers trembled like leaves in the wind as I tore the envelope open. "Dear Mother, I don't know why I'm writing. Maybe because Dad is gone and I don't know what to do about it. I'm mad at you. I hate you for what you did, for leaving, for not fighting for us. But I saw you at the funeral and you looked broken like me. Like Noah. I don't want to forgive you, but I can't stop thinking about you. You're still my mom, even if I don't want you to be. Noah asks about you. He doesn't speak, but I see. He's bored. Me too, sometimes. But I don't know how to go back to what it was. Maybe it's impossible. I just wanted you to know that we are alive, and we haven't forgotten you. Grace." I read the letter over and over until the words began to blur. I clutched the paper to my chest, feeling its edges dig into my skin as if it could keep me from falling. Grace, my Grace. Her words were as sharp as a knife, but there was love in them, even if she was hiding behind anger. Noah was bored. They haven't forgotten. I sat looking at the river outside the window, and for the first time in many years, I felt something warm rolling down my cheeks. I cried. Not loudly, not hysterically, but quietly, like rain hitting the glass. The tears were salty, foreign, as if they belonged to someone else. I cried for Grace, for Noah, for Troy, for my father, for Lena, for myself. I cried for the woman who kissed Troy in the rain, for the mother who sang lullabies, for Jess who lost everything but was still breathing. I cried because the letter was a drop of water in the desert, and I didn't know how to drink it, but I wanted to. I read the letter every day. In the morning, before the kitchen, in the evening, before bed. I folded it carefully and kept it in my pocket, like a talisman. It was my anchor, my mirror, my proof that I still existed for them. I didn't write back, I didn't know what to say, I didn't know if I had the right. But I held on to their words, as Oliver held his books, as the river held its secrets. I continued to work, washing, cleaning, step by step, as Oliver taught. I ate even when I didn't want to because I knew I had to live to see Grace and Noah again. I washed myself, looking into the cracked mirror, and saw how my eyes became clearer, how my skin lost its gray tint. I wasn't beautiful, I wasn't whole, but I was alive. Oliver came, as always, with books and words. He saw the letter, saw my red eyes, but didn't ask. He just said, "You go, Jess. Small steps." And I nodded because he was right. I walked, slowly, awkwardly, but I walked. I started going out into the city. The shelter gave me a job cleaning a small office on Main Street that smelled of paper and coffee. I swept the floors, wiped the tables, cleaned the windows until they sparkled, reflecting my face pale, but with a sparkle in my eyes. The job was simple, but it was mine. I received money, small, but enough to buy a new jacket, to put something in my pocket, to feel like a person and not a shadow. The people in the office didn't know my story, and I was grateful for their indifference. They called me Jess, and that was enough. The city has changed, or maybe it's me that has changed. The diner where I met Troy was still standing, but its sign was faded, like my memories of him. I passed by without going in, but every time I looked at my reflection in the window, a woman who walked forward and did not fall. I saw the river, the bridge where Oliver read his books, and sometimes I went to see him and brought him coffee or a candy bar, which he accepted with a wry smile. "You look alive, Jess," he said one day, and I nodded because he was right. The meeting with Lena happened unexpectedly. I was in the supermarket, choosing apples, when I heard her voice behind me. "Jessica." She said my name like a question, as if she wasn't sure it was me. I turned, and her face aged, but still bright was like a blow. She stood with a basket in a blue coat. Her hair was neatly styled, as always. I felt the old hatred stir within me, but it was weaker than before, like a shadow, not a storm. "Lena," I said. My voice was even, but my fingers squeezed the apple tighter than necessary. She looked at me, her eyes searching for something the Jess she knew, or the Jess I had become. Are you okay?" she asked, and I heard in her voice not pity, but anxiety. I shrugged, putting the apple in the basket. "Alive. This is already something." She nodded, her lips trembling, as if she wanted to smile, but did not dare. "I heard you are in the shelter. I wanted to come, but—" "No need," I interrupted, softer than I expected. "I didn't want you to come." She fell silent, looking at her hands, gripping the handle of the basket. "I didn't know how to help you, Jess," she said finally. "After everything, after Troy, after the children, I thought you hated me." I looked at her, at the woman who was my mother, but always seemed so far away, so happy when I was in hell. "I hated it," I said honestly. "You lived, Lena, and I was dying. It was unfair." Her eyes filled with tears, but she did not turn away. "I didn't know how to get you out," she said quietly. "I lost your father, and I was afraid of losing you. But I didn't know how to be strong for both of us." I was silent, feeling her words settling like drops of water on dry ground. I didn't forgive her, not completely, not like in the books or movies. But I understood. She was a person like me, with her own cracks, her own fears. She couldn't save me, just as I couldn't save myself then. But now I was learning, step by step, and maybe she was learning too. "I'm moving on," I said, looking into her eyes. "Not back. But I'm going." She nodded, her tears falling to the floor, but she smiled, weakly but sincerely. "That's good, Jess. That's all I wanted." We stood in the aisle, between apples and bananas, and I felt the shadow between us become lighter, not disappear, but lose weight. I didn't hug her. I didn't tell her that I loved her. But I walked away holding the basket and knew that maybe one day we'd talk again. The meeting with Noah happened a week later. I was in a cafe on the corner, drinking coffee at a table by the window when he entered. He was taller than I remembered, with long arms and eyes the same blue as Troy's. He saw me immediately, and his face, a mixture of surprise and uncertainty, was like a mirror of my own feelings. I froze, the mug in my hands became hot, but I didn't let go. "Mother?" he said, and this word, as simple as breathing, cut me deeper than I expected. "Noah," I answered, my voice shaking, but I smiled. "Sit down." He sat down opposite him, his backpack falling to the floor with a thud. He looked at me as if he was looking for the Jess he knew, and I watched him find her, piece by piece. "Grace said she wrote to you," he said, fiddling with the hem of his sleeve. "I didn't know if you would answer." I shook my head, feeling the letter in my pocket become heavy. I didn't answer, but I read it every day. He nodded, his eyes serious, too old for 15. "You look alive," he said, his words like light shining through the cracks. I laughed, quietly but sincerely. "I'm trying," I answered. "And you? How are you, Noah?" He shrugged, but his smile, faint as the spring sun, was the one I remembered. "Fine. Grace, she's angry, but she's always like this, and I was just bored." I clutched the mug, feeling the tears welling up, but I didn't let them fall. "I missed you too," I said, and it was true, naked as a river. "I don't know how to be a mother now, Noah, but I want to study." He looked at me, and in his eyes there was not hatred, not anger, but something soft, like water. "Just be," he said. "That's enough." We sat, drank coffee, talked about little things about school, about his drawings, about how he wants a dog. I listened, absorbing his voice, his laughter, his life. I didn't know if Grace would forgive me, if she would come back, but Noah was here, and that was more than I dared hope for. I left the cafe as the sun was setting. The street was noisy, full of people, cars, and life. I walked holding my head straight, feeling how Grace's letter and Noah's words lay in my heart like stones that do not pull me down, but keep me afloat. My shadow followed me new, not as heavy as before. I didn't look back, didn't look for the past in shop windows, didn't listen to the whisper of the river. I walked forward, step by step, as Oliver taught, as life taught. I didn't know what would happen next, whether Grace would forgive me, whether I would find a home, whether I would become a mother again. But I knew I was alive, and that was enough. The street led me further, and I walked, straight, not backward, with a new shadow that was mine. Subscribe to our channel so that your love doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even think click to the next one.